The morning light filtered through the stained glass, casting long, colored shadows across the pews. Dennis Rader sat in the front row, his head bowed in prayer. Around him, the congregation murmured in unison, their voices rising toward the rafters. No one looked twice at him. They saw a pillar of the community, a man who organized the bulletins and greeted neighbors with a steady hand. He mirrored their posture, his movements slow and practiced. He was the picture of devotion, a man anchored in faith, but beneath that composure, there was no resonance of spirit. There was only the cold, mechanical hum of a mind that treated his life like a series of checklists. He knew exactly where the exits were, who sat behind him, and how long the service would last. He was not there to repent. He was there to maintain the structure of his deception. He held the prayer book firmly, his knuckles white, while his gaze remained fixed on the altar. To everyone else, he was a man of God. To the shadows he left behind, he was a predator waiting for the world to turn its back. The year was 1974. The Otero home stood quiet, a suburban sanctuary unaware of the shadow crossing its threshold. Rader moved through the kitchen with a chilling, practiced precision. He found the phone lines and severed them, ensuring the house was cut off from the world. He waited in the dark, motionless, listening to the muffled sounds of the family returning to what they thought was safety. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He moved room by room, turning a home into a trap. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, 4 people lay bound and strangled. There were no footprints left on the floorboards, no signs of a struggle that could be traced back to him. He erased a family, leaving behind a void where life had been only hours before. The community awoke to the silence of that house, unaware that this was not a random act of violence. It was the first entry in a calculated ledger. Rader walked away from the scene, his pace steady, his mind already organizing the next step of his project. The silence after the Otero murders was not enough for him. He needed the world to acknowledge the author of the void. Months passed, and the investigation clawed through dead ends. Unaware that the architect of the chaos was watching from the periphery, Rader made a single, deliberate phone call to the local newspaper. He offered directions, a map of his own design. He led the investigators to a dusty, forgotten book hidden on the shelves of the public library. Inside, resting between the pages, was a note. It was not a plea for mercy or a confession of guilt. It was a manifesto. He inked 3 letters onto the paper: B, T, and K. Bind, torture, kill. The name hung in the air, cold and definitive. With those 3 characters, he transformed a series of brutal, isolated crimes into a terrifying singular narrative. The public, previously searching for a motive, now faced a predator who demanded the spotlight. He had branded his own depravity, turning the fear of a city into his personal gallery. The terror was no longer a random occurrence. It was a project, and he was the proud, calculating curator of the carnage. The terror did not stop at the library. It moved through the suburbs like a slow, creeping frost. Rader tracked Catherine Bright, watching her windows from the dark, then shifted his focus to Shirley Vian. He approached each new crime with the same detached, surgical focus. His life became a grid of targets and deadlines. After he ended the life of Nancy Fox, he did not vanish into the night. He picked up the telephone. His voice was flat, devoid of panic or regret. He reported the location of the body to the police, with the indifferent tone of a clerk filing a mundane report. He spoke of the victims not as people, but as assignments. He kept a mental inventory of his progress, checking off completed tasks with a terrifying sense of accomplishment. Each call to the authorities was a deliberate play for control, a reminder that he was the one dictating the terms of the city's fear. He remained calm, steady, and utterly removed from the horror he inflicted. To him, the act of taking a life was merely another bullet point in a long, systematic list of objectives. Then, in 1979, the calls ceased. The city waited for the next strike, but the silence stretched into months, then years. Rader pulled back into the fabric of the community. He became a man of routine and responsibility. He worked for a security company, spending his days installing alarms in homes across Wichita. He walked through the front doors of the very people he had once hunted, offering them the illusion of safety while he measured the vulnerability of their lives. He coached scout troops and sat in church pews, his presence becoming a fixture of the mundane. He raised his children and attended town meetings, performing the role of a pillar of society with flawless execution. The police files gathered dust in cold storage as the investigation stalled, crippled by a lack of new leads. To his neighbors, he was a reliable, quiet man who kept to himself. They saw a helper, a neighbor, a father. They did not see the predator who had merely changed his methods. He lived in plain sight, a shadow hiding behind the bright, everyday light of middle-class life, waiting for the world to forget the name he had given himself. The decades passed in a blur of mundane routines, but the silence eventually became a burden. In 2004, a local newspaper published an article marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero case. Rader sat in his home, reading the words on the page. He felt the cold sting of irrelevance. The world was moving on, and his name was being scrubbed from the public consciousness. He was no longer the phantom of Wichita. He was merely a man waiting for his life to end. The boredom was absolute. He decided that the city needed a reminder of who he was. He took a pen and began to write. He crafted letters filled with cryptic details and intricate puzzles designed to taunt the investigators who had long since abandoned his trail. He was not just returning to the shadows. He was stepping into the light to demand his due. He spent his evenings arranging packages and mapping out communication routes to the media. The dormant predator was awake. He was ready to trade his anonymity for the spotlight, unaware that his own vanity would provide the very path the police needed to find him. The packages began to arrive at newsrooms and police stations with the calculated rhythm of a heartbeat. Rader was no longer content with silence. He craved the immediate feedback of public terror. He sent envelopes containing personal items taken from his victims, photographs, and complex puzzles that served as breadcrumbs for his past atrocities. Each delivery was a deliberate provocation. In the precinct, the atmosphere shifted from stagnant indifference to frantic urgency. Detectives cleared their desks, reopening boxes that had remained sealed for over 20 years. They realized this was not a copycat, but the original architect of the nightmare returning to finish his work. Rader watched the news, tracking the impact of his messages with a sense of immense satisfaction. He felt the pull of the spotlight and leaned into it, misinterpreting the police investigation as a tribute to his own brilliance. He played the game with the confidence of a man who believed he was invisible. He did not realize that by engaging with the authorities, he was slowly tightening a knot around his own throat. Every letter he mailed and every puzzle he crafted brought the investigators one step closer to the truth he thought he had buried. The game reached its final critical junction when Rader sought to verify his security. He sent a message to the authorities, his tone detached and clinical. He wanted to know if a floppy disk could be traced back to its origin. He waited, his fingers drumming against his desk, calculating the risks. The response came through the media. The investigators knew exactly what they were doing. They lied. They told the public that a floppy disk could not be traced. The words were a trap, and Rader walked straight into it. He felt a surge of pride. Convinced that his technical mastery remained ahead of their dated methods, he reached for a disk, loaded it with his data, and prepared it for delivery. He did not hesitate. He did not double-check his work. The arrogance that had fueled his decades of silence now blinded him to the obvious. He dropped the disk into the mail, certain he had outsmarted the law one last time. He did not know that the moment the package left his hand, he had signed his own warrant. The digital trail was live, and the trap was finally set. The disk arrived at the lab under heavy security. Technicians worked in silence, bypassing the surface files to reach the hidden layers. They found it. A single line of metadata embedded in the document, pointing directly to a computer at a local church. The investigators stared at the screen. The impossible had become undeniable. They needed more than a digital ghost. They needed a name. They cross-referenced the location with existing cold case evidence. A breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. DNA evidence taken from his daughter's medical records. It was a perfect match to the biological samples recovered from the 1,974 crime scene. The connection was absolute. The man who had walked among his neighbors, who had coached scouts and sat in the front pew, was no longer a shadow. The decades of mystery collapsed into a single, concrete reality. He was a husband, a father, and a killer. The investigation moved from the digital realm to the physical world with terrifying speed. Every detail, every secret, and every act of violence now linked back to one man. The hunt was over, and the truth was waiting just outside his door. The 25th of February, 2005. It was a standard lunch break. Rader climbed into his car, his mind likely occupied with his afternoon schedule. He turned the key and pulled away from his workplace, oblivious to the unmarked cruisers trailing him. He turned onto the road, and suddenly, the path vanished. Tires screeched as police vehicles swerved, boxing him in against the curb. The doors flew open. Officers swarmed the car with weapons drawn. Rader did not struggle. He did not shout. He stepped out of the vehicle and surrendered with a face that remained completely blank, as if he were merely filling out a routine form. He stood on the pavement while the officers moved in to secure him. His hands were placed behind his back, the metal cuffs clicking into place. Even in this moment, his ego demanded control. He looked at his coffee cup sitting on the console and made a final, unsettling request. He asked the arresting officer to write the letters BTK on the cup before it was logged into evidence. He wanted his signature on the history of his own capture. The mask he had worn for 30 years was gone, replaced by the hollow pride of a man who still viewed his life as a project to be completed. The courtroom was silent as Rader stepped to the podium. He did not look at the families of the victims. He did not look at the judge. He looked at his notes. He began to speak, and the room seemed to lose its oxygen. He did not describe the agony of his victims. He described the mechanics of his work. He spoke of the phone lines he cut as a system failure. He detailed the binding of limbs as if he were explaining a construction repair. He used the terminology of a technician, referring to his murders as projects, neatly filed and completed. He corrected the prosecutor on minor points of his own history with the precision of a man recounting a successful budget report. There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation, and certainly no apology. He stood there, a man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight, now revealing the absolute emptiness at his core. The audience watched, shivering, as he took pride in the efficiency of his cruelty. It was not a confession of guilt. It was a performance of ego. He treated the courtroom like a workshop, meticulously detailing the destruction of lives with the same detachment he once used to install security alarms. Every word was a hammer blow to the collective conscience of the room, proving that the man behind the mask had never truly felt human. The gavel fell, marking the end of the public spectacle. 10 consecutive life terms meant the world would never see him again. He was processed, stripped of his autonomy, and locked away in a Kansas prison cell. The concrete walls became his new perimeter. Outside those walls, the life he had carefully constructed to hide his true nature disintegrated. His family sought refuge in the shadows, changing their names and moving to places where the name Rader held no weight. They vanished into the anonymity he had violently stripped from his victims. He remains in that cell today, a man who once orchestrated the silence of others, now swallowed by his own. He sits within a restricted space, left only with the memory of the projects he once bragged about. The public has moved on, and the media has ceased its inquiries. He is no longer the pillar of the community or the man in the front pew. He is defined solely by 3 letters, a cold acronym etched into the history of his crimes. He sought to be remembered, but he is known only by the mark of the lives he stole. The man is gone. Only the stain remains.